Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to York Environment Week 2020, and with us, Good Food York. And this is also part of Circular Yorkshire Month, which is run by the York and North Yorkshire Enterprise Partnership. So, Good Food York is a group of people from academics, business owners, retired people, and people working in government services who come together to look at how can we develop sustainable and resilient networks and provisions for York. We're also part of the Sustainable Food Places cluster, which is a group of people in multiple cities around the UK who come together sharing the same vision. And before we get started introducing our first speaker, we would like to play you a short trailer which is the Kiss the Ground. If you've not seen it, I would highly recommend watching it. It's you can currently find it on Netflix, and we were actually hoping we can set up a live stream of this early next year.
There's so much bad news about our planet, it's overwhelming. The truth is, I've given up. This is the story of a simple solution, a way to heal our planet. The solution is right under our feet, and it's as old as dirt.
All of our soils that are under chemical conventional agriculture are almost completely devoid of microorganisms.
Modern agriculture was not designed for the betterment of the soil.
Fossil fuels are by no means the only thing that is causing climate change. When we damage soils, carbon goes back to the atmosphere.
But when we destroy soil, it releases carbon dioxide.
Biosequestration is using plants, trees, and techniques of grazing and farming to capture carbon and store it in the soil.
We can fix a lot of our climate issues if we bring the CO2 down into a living plant and put it back into the soil where it belongs.
Plants working with soil microorganisms, it seems too simple.
Healthy soils lead to a healthy plant, healthy human, healthy climate.
There could be a way to eat food that heals the planet.
The problem isn't the animal. The problem is where the animals are at.
How do we take waste and repurpose and reuse it, because it's really not waste?
The poop has to stay in the loop.
Compost is just one of a suite of soil-based carbon capture solutions.
We know how to do it. And if we continue to scale over 30 years, we can reverse global warming.
We can get the Earth back to the Garden of Eden that it once was by regeneration. To see biodiversity return to a place that was completely devastated.
That gives me hope.
Our health and the health of our planet are connected.
If you look over here, my neighbor's land that has been chemical fallow, then you look over at our paddocks, you have a diversity of different plant species. Which model do you want your food to be produced from? The answer is pretty simple to me.
I'll make you a deal. I won't give up, and neither should you.
Now, that is pretty inspiring stuff. As I mentioned, you can watch that now on Netflix, or actually find more information on that on kisstheground.com on their website. So to talk more about this approach to regenerative agriculture, I'd like to now introduce you to Harry Holden. Over to you, Harry.
Okay, Rich, if you can just slip down one slide. As Paul Hawkins has said, we must work with nature. We can no longer beat around the bush. We are in a mess. According to the United Nations, we have only 60 years of fertility left in our agricultural soils, and we are on course to breach the safe global temperature rise of 2 degrees C by the end of this century, if not before. Vast swathes of this country are at risk of flooding because due to our industrial farming practices, we have depleted the soils and destroyed its natural water holding capacity. We have also continued to build on unsuitable floodplains. We've replaced farming practices based on thousands of years of ancestral knowledge with a chemically dependent industrial agriculture, which has degraded the soil, eliminated biodiversity, stripped food of essential ingredients, and enslaved and indebted farmers to major agricultural corporations. However, at last there is something that makes me very optimistic about our future. Just as the vaccine for COVID-19 opens the way for a bright new future, so the scaling up of organic and regenerative agricultural systems can reverse the damage caused by industrial agriculture. Environmentally focused food and farming systems can improve the social and economic livelihood of farmers, rebuild soil health, promote biodiversity and clean watersheds, and produce healthy food and mitigate climate change by drawing down and storing carbon in the soil. Can move on. This graph emphasizes just how much CO2 is present in our atmosphere today. What it does not show is how much of this excess has already been absorbed by our oceans, which has made them acidify, causing the mass extinction of many species and killing large areas, as we have seen at the Great Barrier Reef. It also does not show that to avoid breaching the 2 degrees C ceiling, then this concentration of CO2 needs to be at 350 ppm, not the current 420. Currently in the UK, 10% of our emissions come from agriculture, and globally this figure rises to 23%, making agriculture a very significant part of this problem. Slide, please. If only there was a way. The solution is the soil, the largest carbon pool of them all, and the only place where all this excess CO2 that is in our atmosphere can be stored. Plants with sunlight and water perform photosynthesis. They pull in carbon dioxide from the air and turn it into carbohydrates and sugars. Some of these sugars are pumped down into the roots to feed microorganisms, who in turn use that carbon to build soil. The carbon is removed from the atmosphere. The plant pumps it into the soil where it is stored using nature's living technology. Simply using nature's technology tried and tested over millions of years. It has also recently been discovered that by applying a thin layer of compost, sets off an ongoing positive feedback loop that brings more and more carbon into the soil each year in concert with regenerative practices. Slide, please. These 5 practices have been proven to develop carbon-enriched soil. Cover crops, land not left bare, but with cover plants will photosynthesize for a longer period, pulling more carbon into the soil through photosynthesis and provide fodder for animals, rather than importing soybeans to provide food for them. Secondly, no-till. When we till and we cultivate the ground, this disturbs the ground, breaks up the carbon cycle, and rather than pulling in CO2, releases CO2 into the atmosphere. Rotating crops. This improves the physical and chemical condition of the soil and thus improves the overall fertility. Nitrogen-fixing legumes fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil through root nodules. Reduce inputs, reduce fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, and the diesel that's required to spread them. The use of chemical fertilizers jeopardize the bacteria that fix nitrogen in the soil, who are responsible for converting atmospheric oxygen into a form of nitrogen that can be used by plants. And finally, incorporate livestock. They will fertilize the ground naturally and incorporate forage. Working on the principles of eat a third, trample a third, and leave a third will bring more carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the soil. Okay, I mean, the question is, if this is all such good news, well, why will farmers, or why are not all farmers doing it? There are some who have already sort of seen the light and understood what it's about, and they have changed over. But we certainly have, if you look at the average age of a farmer in the UK today, it is, I believe, 62. And so that they have had a whole lifetime of doing it the industrial method. and have been very successful at doing that. But unfortunately, what it has done is degraded our land due to some of the things we've talked about already. So there is a big risk for them as an individual and as a small business to take these practices on board and put behind them everything that they've known up till this date. I think, secondly, there is not enough practical information that is available to them to be able to understand it, or rather just in quality and quantity is not available as it should be. And I think we need to address that issue before we're going to make a lot of progress with some of those who've been doing it for an awful long time. I've put in here investment in new equipment. If you are going to move over to a no-till drill, whereby you are having to actually put the seed, or you're going to have to create the seed bed rather than just putting the seed directly into a seed bed, that can become quite expensive. And so that there is a little bit of resistance because of new equipment, but actually it's fairly small in the grand scheme of things. I think lastly, this lack of incentive is very high up the chart of things that need to change. If you look at the carbon market and where it sits, it's very disjointed, it's very broken up, and we need to have clear incentives and clear abilities for our landscape owners and our farmers to be able to get a benefit from actually helping the planet. So sequestering carbon, yes, it's very good, but we need to have an incentive for people to do it. Okay, Rich. So having changed our system, what benefits can we expect to be able to see from it? And the first one is the improvement on drought tolerance. If you increase your carbon percentage in the soil by 1%, you will store 22,000 gallons per acre more water. Now, if you take a soil which from several hundred years ago, it would have contained somewhere between 6 and 8% carbon. If you look at the denatured soils that we currently have, they will have less than 1%. So we have got an awful long way to catch up. If you think that 1% is 22,000 gallons, imagine what 6% would do and make a difference. Only this year in East Anglia, we had a yield reduction of 40% on winter wheat due to the early summer and the soils unable to retain moisture and a lack of rain in April. And this also left London within days of running out of water because the depleted soils will not hold it, and so it's all running off. Secondly is water permeability. Water held in soil is water that is not running off. And carbon-rich soils will hold water for 100 days. Current depleted soils would have lost that same water in 3 days. So much of our Yorkshire flooding is due to carbon-depleted soils, which have lost the ability to retain water. This fast runoff of water brings silt, nitrates, and phosphates that overwhelm our sewage system and pollute our rivers. Nutritious crops. Our crops have been fed from a pharmacy. With regenerative practices, we can restore fertility, not relying on chemicals to produce food, but the goodness that Mother Nature provides, benefiting our foods with high nutritional value. Enhanced yields. Numerous examples of farmers who have changed to regenerative practices are enjoying yields which are up to 10% better than under industrial practices. And decreased inputs is fertilizers, pesticides, and diesels, which make up a large proportion of farm budget. These will also be reduced significantly, making the farm more profitable, as well as protecting the soil microorganisms that build soil carbon and fertility. And the last one, Rich. The potential of agricultural to sequester atmospheric carbon dioxide is the most hopeful thing we know about related to climate change. The first point is it's scalable. obviously, we have a huge acreage around the world. And if we just look at Yorkshire, we have got 2 million acres in Yorkshire, which potentially could sequester some 4 million tons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. If we were to expand this into the whole of the UK, that becomes nearly 100 million tons. Now that is getting close to a third of all the CO2 that we as a nation produce, and would obviously make a significant difference to what's happening in this country. If you actually put that out to the whole world, it starts to become an absolute huge number or huge amount that could be sequestered. Affordable, because we are in a position that we don't need any new technology, we don't need a huge research and development program to develop this, then it becomes affordable. Because we have the land, we have the techniques, we know what to do, then it can be done immediately. I mean, we can literally start this today. And of all the pieces that have been put forward, this is the only one that I know of that potentially could get to a position where we could actually reverse climate change, and we could start to draw down this CO2 and put it back in the ground where it belongs. If there are 3 things that I would ask you to take away from this, firstly, that agriculture is a significant part of the climate change problem, and it's not just about cattle and methane. Secondly, agriculture represents the quickest, most cost-effective solution to climate change. And that 3, pulling carbon from the atmosphere into the soil using nature's technology is the solution. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harry. That was brilliant. So any questions, do post them in the chat. I mean, one of the questions is, how do we get more people in the UK developing this? So obviously quite a lot of the things that come out from the Kiss the Ground is very much about the US.
Yeah,
challenges?
I think there are a number of things. I think that what is becoming pretty evident from our change away from the common agricultural policy is that the payments that have gone to farmers traditionally for the last 60 years or whatever are going to be at best halved. And so farmers are going to have to start to look probably a lot harder than they've needed to for a while as other ways to generate income. And the generation of the income, you know, some people call regenerative farming carbon farming, and in some ways it is. And I think if you look at the, you have the polluter, and you would like to say, well, the polluter pays, but actually in a lot of ways the polluter is not going to pay. And I would much rather see it reversed to say, actually the sequesterer gets paid. And I think that agriculture can work itself around because they have this huge opportunity to help the planet sequester this carbon and hopefully get paid or get incentivized in some way to which they do it. Now, to make that work, there needs to be a carbon trading platform that is set up, which would obviously have to be agreed with the government and worked in with the government. But I think if there was ever going to be a way which really got behind this initiative, it would be to say, yes, we will form carbon credits. Yes, we're right, we've got to measure and verify them. And that would allow those who do change where they're going to sequester and build up their soil carbon will get some kind of a payment.
That's great. Thank you. We'll come back to that actually with Ruth's question. But first of all, Jeff has raised his hand. If you'd like to ask yours directly, Jeff, your microphone's working. Jeff Beacon.
Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is, yes. Yeah, it sounds very good stuff, and I very much would welcome paying farmers to do the right thing and getting some carbon credits in. But the average cow emits 100 kilograms of methane a year, and that's a very powerful gas.
Yeah.
And sheep are probably worse. So, except for that aspect of the scheme, and I've watched the full film, it is very good, but very worried about the use of so much cattle.
Okay, I think there are two things. Firstly, nitrous oxide has got to be the worst, which is where 99% of it comes from nitrogen-based fertilizers. And nitrous oxide is 298 times more aggressive than CO2 is. As far as so that's why they drive about fertilizer, because fertilizer is just like spraying oil all over your fields. It's terrible stuff. If you look at cattle, and the bit I understand is that you almost have to put them into two parts. One is that cattle and sheep were designed to eat grass and to live on grass, and their whole cycle evolved around grass. We've taken that away and said, oh no, you're not doing that anymore. Actually, we're going to put you in a shed, and we're going to feed you nitrates, nutrients. We're going to inject you with all kinds of stuff so that you don't get ill. And then we're going to say, there's a real problem. As I understand it, and I don't understand it particularly well, if you go into a situation where you have these animals and they're outside and they're eating grass and they're getting moved on all the time, methane becomes less of an issue. I don't understand why, but I'm told that it does. But I understand exactly what you're saying. But I think that in the public's perception, we've got to a position that says, agriculture is a problem because of the cattle. Well, actually, it's not just the cattle. Cattle are a small part of it, but actually the biggest issue is the soil and what we have done to the carbon pool in the soil, which is basically smash it all up and put it up into the atmosphere.
Yes, that's good. That's good stuff. But I'm still worried that you saying it has a small part of the problem. It is quite a large part of the problem.
I think that we look at food, and we look at the food circles, etc., etc. If you look how much of our agriculture is put down to producing animal feed, if you talk about soybeans, basically soybeans is animal feed. It's nothing to do with feeding humans. It's all about how do I feed cattle. So I agree that the methane thing, I think, is a problem. I think that the soybean issue is a huge problem, because that's where most of the Amazon is going, is to produce soybeans to feed European cattle. But I wouldn't lower the issue about methane, and to be honest with you, I don't know enough about it to give you a really sensible answer.
Well, we can dig that out when we're looking. I mean, one of the comments I just put in there is a type of seaweed that they're looking at trials to actually introduce into the feedstock to reduce the amount of methane outputs. But let's keep the questions coming. I mean, there's quite a few people mentioning carbon credits here. So are there any carbon credits setups in the UK or elsewhere, Harry?
There are carbon credits. Where do I go back to? If I go back to the European system, which obviously we are just about to come out of in the next 5 weeks or whatever, the European carbon system was set up on a basis that the governments would provide allowances to those companies which were producing a lot of CO2. In the initial stages, they gave them far too many, and so therefore it became no incentive to stop producing CO2. Over time, they have realized that they've overgiven them away, and they are now reducing that, because when they were giving so many away, the price of carbon was only about $2 or $3 and nobody really cared about it. Because they've now reduced how much they're going to give to them, it has now gone up to a position where it's about 30 euros a carbon credit. And people are now starting to look at that and thinking, oh, actually, this is perhaps worth having. The biggest drivers, as far as America is concerned, is a company called Indigo Ag. Indigo Ag have just done a protocol with a company called Vera, which says how you can produce credits from the ground. As it stands at the moment in Europe and in the UK, there is no such protocol for soil management, but there will be, and that protocol will probably be about 9 months away, I suppose, whereby agriculture in the UK will be able to earn credits mainly by increases in their soil carbon percentage. So it'll be a differential between 1 year and the next. If you look at how much you would expect to get off an acre of land, you would expect, if it was managed regeneratively, that you would probably get 2 credits per acre. If you farm it industrially, you'll get no credits per acre because you won't make any soil carbon. And that's really what this discussion is all about. You know, if we carry banging on the way we are at the moment, in 40 or 50 years, actually, we won't be able to grow anything. So it's all about getting the soil carbon and getting the soil carbon up. And I think, you know, so relevant to us here in Yorkshire is it's because of our denuded and denigrated soils is why we keep on getting flooded. If we actually got the soil carbon up in the encatchment areas, we would not get flooded. I don't know if that answers the question about carbon credits.
It's making sure that, isn't it, that the credits are then spent on the right thing, because I saw somewhere that Monsanto were having vouchers for the spending of carbon credits, so you could spend them on herbicides. So it's kind of like, yeah, you can do, you know, the polluter pays, and then you go and buy crap to put on, sorry for swearing, but you put to put back in your crops, and it's not quite to the point. Well, it's not quite at all.
What has happened is there have been a number of what they call voluntary carbon credits, which has been a lot of the ones that have done in sort of Africa, etc. And they've been almost sort of, you know, as long as you didn't use firewood, you used coal, it was all right, you know, so they give you a credit for, and it was kind of very low key. It needs to be a very strict standard, which means that it's going to be valuable, because I think in the not too distant future, because we won't be able to meet our net zero commitments, then the people who are actually having to purchase credits, it's going to start coming down the pecking order. I mean, it's just really been with the energy companies and the concrete making companies. Eventually, it is going to come all the way down, just because we're not going to be able to offset the 370 million tons we produce every year.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, one of the things that's actually coming up in the questions now as well is Lucy actually will answer your questions in the next section. But Louise is Daniel's actually asking is, what can consumers do to support regenerative farming? And then we'll go to George's question afterwards. So what can consumers do, or non-farmers, to support regenerative farming? I guess small question for you.
Okay. Oh, okay. As it stands at the moment, it is difficult because regeneratively farmed produce is not particularly labelled up as being that. But I mean, a good start would be grass-fed beef, because they have to be done regeneratively. And also, you know, regenerative farming and organic farming are very close neighbours. You know, they sit quite close to each other. And so therefore, to sort of support that organic, which begets regenerative stuff, that would be a great help. I think as far as what can you do on your own, certainly what Adrian has got in his piece will be very useful. And so rather than steal that thunder, you know, sort of watch what Adrian's doing. But also it comes back to, you know, what can you do in your own house, etc., etc. The first thing I would say is stop buying Roundup. It's glyphosate. One, it's not going to do you any good, and secondly, it has been splattered all over the countryside for I don't know how many 20, 30, 40 years, and we need to stop using it. You know, it's terrible stuff. So stop using glyphosate. Stop using fertilizers on your lawn. Where you can, don't dig, just stick it straight into the ground. I think these little things, which I know that Sean will come on and talk about as well, but I appreciate that it's a bit tricky at the moment to actually pick something out and say, well, if I buy that, then I'm supporting it. But in general, the sort of organic movement would be a help.
Great, we've got time for one more question. So George, if you can unmute yourself, unless you've typed something in, I do apologise.
Yeah, I live very close to Askham Bryan Agricultural College in York.
Yeah.
And as I was listening to you talking about the various practices,
yes,
and just going through my mind and wondering the extent to which these are discussed and talked about at our colleges like Askham Bryan around this country.
George, absolutely fascinating. I went to agricultural college, and the people that I meet who are now actively engaged in regenerative agriculture, are all of them, to a man or a woman, are saying everything I learned is completely against what actually I should be doing now. Completely, you know, to the point of just go and burn all your books. You know, all the stuff about fertilizer rates and stocking rates and yield, it's all wrong. And so therefore it's almost the kind of saying, right, okay, let's skip the last 60 years, go back to what we used to talk about and how we used to talk about it, because actually that is what is going to make the difference. And the big thing to me is that actually people who are doing it, then they are, in terms of yields, etc., they are no worse off. But in terms of in their back pocket, because they're not having to fork out for all this fertilizer, for all the pesticides, they are significantly better off. And you know, I think the thing that needs to change in agriculture, because to a certain extent they have been sort of mollycoddled and said, oh look, you know, we know times up, here's some money, rather than saying you are a small business, and a small business has to look at what its top line is. It has to look at what its inputs are, and it needs to balance its books. And they haven't had to do that because most of them haven't run it like a business. They've just said, well, that's what I need to do. Oh, and I'm going to get that paid by the EU, so that should be fine. And they've looked at it as a sale rather than a grant. So as far as Askham Bryan is concerned, I don't know, but I do know that a chap called Bill Meredith, who runs Bishop Burton, they are looking. What is it? He calls it precision agriculture, where they use as little as they can, but to still get the same result, rather than actually trying to perhaps get rid of it altogether.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Harry. Any other questions for Harry? Please put them in the chat and we'll give him some homework before we get back to you all. You know, we've got a few more days of lockdown, so it's not like he's going anywhere bar walking his dog. Isn't that right, Harry?
Absolutely.
So thank you very much. You can sit back and relax now and listen to the next part of our journey here. So now we've got a little video. So we're now going to hear a bit about Food Circle, and Adrian here is actually interviewing Joe Fennerty. Now, Joe would have loved to have come along today, but unfortunately, Food Circle, one of the main days where they actually are doing their cooking, is actually on a Saturday. So we recorded this with Joe during the week. So please sit back and enjoy this short 20-minute interview about some of the projects that actually some people have actually brought up in the questions.
Hi, Joe. Adrian Lovett here from Good Food York as part of our event for York Environment Week. Thanks very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. Can you tell us a bit about where you are now?
Yeah, no problem. We're at Tanghall Community Centre. It's Thursday market time, so yeah, Jim's in the kitchen. We're waiting for some producers to come down, and then we'll get set up for tonight.
Can you tell us a bit about how you got into running food circles?
Yeah, I've been in the food industry for over 10 years now. Yeah, starting off as a chef in kitchens, and then moving into like community growing and cooking projects in Edinburgh, London, Leeds. And yeah, Food Circle was created out of basically a frustration at the current food system. There's lots of great projects up and down in the country doing different things with food, but what I couldn't see was a system in place to challenge or offer an alternative to the modern food system. So I had no idea what it would look like or really how to go about it, but that's the goal. Create something that works for the local.
You can see from the map that you built up a wonderful array of providers. Can you give us a bit of an overview about how you set about finding them, and then we can go and look at some of them in a bit more detail?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, this map was created a couple of years back, and to be fair, most of the folk on the map at the minute are very well established organisations. So Newfields have been going up. The veg producers up at Moors have been going for over 30 years. You know, Bottom Village is, you know, one of the innovators in terms of biodynamic foods in the UK. Yeah, so to be honest, it's a small network in Yorkshire. If you're doing anything on a smaller scale or organic, you know who's in that network, to be honest. So it wasn't too hard finding them. The issue we have now is trying to expand and really cement this style of food production. So there are a few new ones on the map. We see Grassfruits there as well, who've only been going up for about 5 years now. So the first part of the job was obviously finding these initial producers to create something, some sort of market in York. The next job was trying to build up our audience, our customer base, to give us a bit of buying power and to show that there was actually a market for any emerging producers out there. And I suppose the next stage now is to try and stimulate those new enterprises and anyone who's just getting going. We can offer them, you know, financial and marketing support, but then also try and look at forming cooperatives where it's necessary for infrastructure or, again, buying or selling power. So yeah, that's where we are now. Yeah, they're an institution, really. As I said before, they've been going you know, over 30 years. That's Rosemary Wass in the picture there. Her husband Howard, who sadly passed away a number of years ago, set up the farm, and yeah, it was one of the first organic in the region. And what's just incredibly special about Newfields is that it is a proper mixed arable farm. So they've got 14 odd acres of veg production, another 20 of potato, a bit more on cereals, and then they've got beef and lamb as well. So you just don't see this style of farm very often because of the sheer workload that it involves throughout the year. It just doesn't let up. So, you know, they're veg cutting from June through till, you know, January. Then they've got calving and seed potato grading, etc. And then they've got lambing, land prep, planting, weeding, and then you're back into it. So with most styles of farming nowadays, you've got 3 or 4 intense parts of the year where you're harvesting and drilling in the autumn, but then for the most part, unless you've got livestock, it's a fairly easy ride for the rest of it. So John, the lad, the farm manager who's now taken on the farm, which is a really positive step for us. You know, he's an absolute nutter. He'll work, you know, 100 hours a week, just as a standard. There's just no let up. So that's why there's not many of these farms around. But yeah, it's sheer quality in terms of what they produce.
Certainly is, in terms of the flavours we get every week.
Rob's been going almost as long as Newfield, so he was off my radar for a fair bit. They're celebrating 25 years this January, but him and his brother Paul are quite extraordinary characters. Really, they've decided to breed and have Dexter beef production in the Yorkshire Rings. So their tagline is beef as a byproduct of conservation. So they work with Natural England to graze the ancient meadowlands of the Ings, which is quite extraordinary, really. So Dexter cows are small carcasses. They've got no value really in terms of a modern market. So if they were just to sell them at a market, they'd be running at a loss. So unusually, Rob and Paul sell all their meat direct, which is quite a phenomenal achievement, really. And I think this is what we'll see with all the small-scale production, is that there aren't really any models that you can copy or take from in this country or globally. There's examples that you have, but generally these producers are working everything out for the first time. So it's just great to have Rob in the network, to be honest, with all his knowledge and all his frustrations and hard times that he's been through. He's really is at the pinnacle of regenerative meat production. Yeah, I very much like Fraser. He just turned 30 this year, and I've been following his project pretty much since its inception, really. So he started off with a few acres in his family farm in Acklam before moving to Escrick Estate, which is what you can see down there. It's a forest woodland. So this is a very interesting one. I actually revisited it for the first time in a year yesterday, and it's just phenomenal, the kind of progress that Fraser's making here. So he was initially brought in because the estate at Escrick was struggling in the woodlands with invasive species like Himalayan balsam, and in other parts of the country there had been some success clearing this with pigs. So Fraser did approach them to see if they could set up like a pilot program, and he's been there for over 2 years now. But he's finally got enough livestock on the ground where he can make some incredible differences to the pastures in the woodland. They are breaking down everything, and you're seeing this regrowth, which is phenomenal. And there's a potential in the coming years that this could actually be grazable pastures for cattle and sheep as well as the pigs. So yeah, he's at the forefront of pork production, really.
Wonderful. Can we move on to the next slide and move on to looking at other bits of the market? Tell us a bit about the apple co-op.
Yeah, again, I think how we look at we're kind of a difficult point, I think, in terms of creating like a better food system. I think a lot of what goes on, especially in the urban environments, is concentrating on food waste and food poverty. And though these are obviously important, and we need to make some breakthroughs there, what I often think is lacking is actually recognizing food value. And I think that's exactly the problem we had with working with the Abundance Project, which is basically an urban collection of people's unwanted fruit, which, you know, obviously is unsprayed, generally comes from kind of like heritage trees. So we have great diversity, great flavors. But again, the market wasn't really there for it. You know, Louise would struggle giving them away, which is exactly the opposite of what we wanted to achieve. We want to create a market value, which will then show other people who are interested in planting orchards themselves, to show that there is value and there is a market for these things. So what we did with Louise at Abundance and Edible York, we created a cooperative with two larger scale private orchards, one in Flaxton and one in Aiken. And the idea was we'd have community cooperative pressings with anything that wasn't of the highest standards. And then with the rest of the fruit, we were going to do our best to set a high market value, but then also have that educational piece running right alongside. So we had a subscription box, which, you know, ran for 14 weeks of the year. It just had the seasonal highlights of that week in there, and we also ran an apple fest as well. Again, just getting the growers and the public together in a room just to, yeah, celebrate what's already growing. So that's where we are now, and then hopefully we can start really utilizing the community orchards that are already around York as well.
Can you tell us a bit about the bottle? That's even bigger than Louise there.
Yeah. Well, that's actually from her pressings. So Louise goes around and does community pressings. This was it Keswick Cuddling? So like one of the early season ones from 2019. Absolutely delicious, and a great example. We tend to for our own bottling, we use have 3 seasons, basically an early, a mid, and a late, where we gather up the apples from those parts, and they're very distinct. You know, each part of the seasons gives a very different flavor, very different note. So again, it's just a very easy example to show people that an apple isn't an apple. You know, there's a whole season, and there's plenty to look forward to.
Wonderful. Can we go on to the next slide and look at the bread? Phil, and your links with Haxby Bakery.
Yeah, I mean, Phil, to be honest, is a phenomenal guy. He's not really just a baker. I mean, he does bake just the best sourdough bread, but he goes kind of beyond that. He's kind of had this link with local producers as soon as he started. And I think that's one of the things we've seen with bakers up and down the country, because their primary ingredients that they need is so limited. They do tend to have a better relationship or a more intense relationship with their millers, with the beekeepers, with, the veg production. And Phil has that, and he's just an incredibly generous guy with his time and his resources. But Phil, he's part of something that we've set up recently, the Yorkshire Grain Alliance, which again is to try and take back a little bit of control in terms of the grain chain. So farmer, miller, and baker. And there's a couple of things that will really benefit, I think, from having these kind of relationships. The first is the potential to tap into other seed banks in terms of what we can actually grow. So on the organic list at the minute, there's literally just 12 varieties of wheat that you can legally grow. Now there's other grain alliances across the country, and there's a lad down in Somerset called Fred Price, who has been building from seed banks onto field scale, these kind of lost grains that actually perform very well in an organic system, a low input system. So we're trying to kind of bring those back. So one of the big wins from last year was we got a variety called April Bearded from Fred, which Mike Stringer, who does our oats and rapeseed oil, he planted last year, and it performed really well in the field, even with a pretty devastating weather conditions during harvest. He got it in, he got it dried and cleaned, and we've had our first go at that, and the flavor is just phenomenal. So that's one thing that will benefit. Then also the development of the infrastructure needed for this, so cleaners, dryers, etc. We're trying to work so that we've got that in place, so that if other farmers want to get involved, then there's a clear process. Then the other link in the chain is obviously the mills. The artisan bakery scene is booming, but the mills haven't really expanded at the same rate as the bakeries. So we're very lucky. We've got Yorkshire Organic up at Spaunton, Trevelyan there, and then newcomers, Worsborough down in Barnsley, a very traditional water driven mill. So again, it's trying to create those relationships where they can take grain direct from the farmers, taking out the merchants, which is often where the transparency is kind of lost.
Yeah. And great thing is that we don't have to go looking all around Yorkshire. You're bringing them together twice a week for people right here in Town Hall.
Yeah, that's the plan. Yeah, everything. Thursday nights and Saturday afternoons. That's the idea.
Just go to the next slide then and see a bit of that. Yeah. It's
well worth coming down here.
Yes, very, very good. Sorry, it's not a great shot. The COVID regulations put a bit of a stop to that, but it's great you're managing to carry on the market. Do you want to just give us a minute or two about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the benefits of working with a community centre is that that's what it's here for, is to serve the local community. So when the first lockdown happened, there was no doubt that the centre wasn't going to be up and running in one form or another. So they based one of the council food hubs here, so they were still getting food packages to those needed, and then that allowed us to continue operating. And it was absolutely key, because obviously lockdown happened, but food was still being produced, and we needed to make sure that market and those avenues was still open to our producers. So yeah, very fortunate to be based here. Right?
Yeah, great. And the last bit is the takeaways. It's not just bringing the food here, but you and Jim cooking it and people being there for people to take away.
I mean, that's a massive part of the business, to be honest, is Jim, our chef. It's really like the taste of the food system. You know, it's often quite limited in terms of the ingredients there, but if you preserve, you pickle, you ferment, you can create, some absolutely soul nourishing food, and we like to think that we are doing that week in, week out with what our brilliant producers can get to us.
Great. And the last slide, I think. You can see a better view of your little yellow submarine.
Yes.
And some of the food that Jim's producing there.
Yeah. No, that's it. Yeah, I'm hungry. Anyway, conversations and relationships with our producers direct. I think that's where we're going to make the real impact.
Yeah, I can speak from experience. It's a wonderful experience, possibility to do it twice a week. You just want to say how people can get in touch with you about that, Joe, sorry.
No worries. Sorry, I don't know why my video is doing that. Best way is to email food.circle.york@gmail.com. We'll get you on the mailing list and keep you up to date.
Great, thank you. Very last slide, if we can. It's good food for York, brought in by Food Circle and collected by local people. Thanks very much, Joe, for all your time and all that lovely insight.
Lovely. Take care, Adrian. Thank you.
Bye.
Well, there we go. If you've got any questions for Adrian, please feel free to ask them. And yes, as somebody's commented, so Hannah is getting hungry just looking at all those pictures of food. I'm actually ravenous now. As going vegan, I have to eat about 20 times a day, but hey ho. So Adrian, how long have you known Joe and his developments?
I suppose 2 to 3 years now. Time flies by. He's had to move around a bit with his market, but it's steadily grown, and there just isn't time in that interview to cover all the producers that he's working with. But I hope it's given a flavour of that, and you can see how it's linking what Harry was talking about, the farmers out there and the growers out there. It'd be really quite difficult for people in York to go out and hunt them all down, but Joe is doing that for us and bringing them in, and twice a week, Thursday evenings and Saturday lunchtimes, he's there with all of this wonderful Yorkshire produce right on tap.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm going to head over there next week, actually, since we celebrate being out of lockdown partially anyway.
I should point out that with the COVID restrictions, you have to get a slot, which is why Joe was giving the email address there. But it's well worth getting a slot and going along. You can highly recommend it.
That's great. Thank you very much, Hannah. Adrian, we're all slipping up here today. So I'd like to move now on to Shan in the final presentation, where we're actually going to be looking into something slightly more close to home. So right. What can we do with Shan?
Yeah. So I think it sometimes, quite often, feels quite daunting. Obviously, there's a need to come up with a solution, but what I tend to try and encourage is rather than looking at how we solve that, to think more about what one thing could we each do that can help. And so what I'm going to talk a bit about is some ideas as to things we can do to actually help grow soil. So as is put here, soil, as we heard earlier, is most fundamental to everything, but actually something we take for granted. Next slide, please. And so my point here is, let's stop treating soil like dirt. Let's start to think about it as that natural thing that we have all around us. It's not just about the soil, it's the growing of the soil. So in your kitchen, rather than thinking about what we throw away, what is waste, let's think about it as ingredients to grow compost, to grow soil. It is the most valuable resource that we have, as we've heard, and there is, in one way or another, a way we can all do something to actually help make more good soil. Next slide, please. So anyone knows me knows that soil is my passion, and it's such fascinating stuff. And we've heard how important it is to the climate, but actually let's step back and look at how soil is made, because that in itself is incredible. It's using hundreds of different organisms, the composting creatures, to break down to compost organic materials, the ingredients to make this wonderful, natural, rich material, the soil that we use to grow. It is, as we've heard, fantastic at retaining moisture, minerals, and all the other nutrients we need to actually grow healthy plants. And, as Adrian alluded to, it's not just about growing, it's about growing food that has the levels of nutrients that it needs. It all sounds simple in a way, but actually it's really clever stuff. So next slide, please. I mentioned the composting creatures. So I call them the workers. You know, if you look in the soil, or if you look in a compost bin, you see all sorts of things there, and they are these wonderful workers who, from the bacteria to the fungi to the worms to the centipedes to the slugs and snails and the woodlice, they are all there playing their part in making soil. And it's you know, when you think about it, it's incredible that's all going on underneath your feet. So the next slide. The other thing I've found fascinating about composting is the way it works. And here's a bit of the science behind it. There are actually 3 stages to the composting process. And it's just fun to know a bit about that. The first is called degradation, which is where tiny microbes, invisible to the naked eye, feed off the chemical components, the nitrogen and the carbon of the organic material, and they multiply rapidly and collect heat, which in turn raises the temperature. And then other microbes that thrive on this heat then do the first pass of the composting. The thermophiles, which are another sort of microbes that thrive at higher temperatures, then take over until all the food sources are exhausted. So that's the first stage. And the next slide. We then move in, no, sorry, that's me, not you. Can we come back one? I'm ahead of myself here. The second stage is the conversion. This is when the temperature drops and another type of microbe, mesophiles, take over to complete the decomposition of the material. And then finally, there's what's called the maturation, which is a microbial activity that decreases the compost as it cools down and provides ideal conditions for large organisms to move in and completely remove the harmful chemicals, the phytotoxins. So I know that's a lot of sort of words and stuff, but I just think it's amazing that nature has worked out not just how to do this, but it works out what to do first, how to do that, when that moves to the next stage and another stage. So that's how it works. And what we have, can I have the next slide now, please? What we have as a result is a compost that's rich, earthy, containing all the valuable plant nutrients that we need in order to grow those healthy plants. And so my point is that by working with nature as opposed to against it to help create new soil, we are doing something really important to step change how more soil is being created. And you know, the whole process is fascinating. So next slide, please. So to me, there's lots of misconceptions about composting, and there's lots of people who say, oh, I have this awful heap of slimy stuff that I can't ever use. And the way that I suggest it's best to look at it, it is like a recipe. It's like making a cake. And you need the right combination of the right ingredients. And it put really simply, that's brown and green. Brown gives you energy, and it's anything that's dry and fibrous. Really good examples of that are cardboard, paper, dry leaves, or small woody prunings. The green gives you the nutrients, and it's normally soft and sappy, like kitchen waste, grass clippings, or young weeds. So it's like that. That's the first principle. You can't do it unless you have both of those things. And then if you come on to the next slide. When I look at it, the other thing I think is really important is that you have to have equal proportions of each of these things, and that's breaking down the brown and the green a bit more. So you take what comes out of your kitchen, things like vegetables, fruit, coffee grounds, tea bags, eggshells. So that would be your first of your 5 elements. The second is you want shredded material like twigs or bark, something that's come out of the garden that has a little bit more structure to it, and that's to sort of keep things open. The third is what comes from the garden in terms of cuttings or leaves. The fourth is your cardboard or paper, and the fifth is your grass cuttings. So equal proportions of each of those is what's really important. It's when you get an imbalance that things go wrong in your compost bin. And the next part of our recipe is, well, what do we need in order to do this? Firstly, we need a kitchen bin in order to collect everything in the kitchen. And what I tend to do in my kitchen bin is to actually start to put in some of the brown materials. Think anything that's perforated is really good. So I'd start to mix that in terms of what I have in the kitchen. And then the second thing you need is something to put it in the garden. And that can be anything. It can be a Dalek, the plastic container. It can be a wooden structure, or it can be a rotating structure. They all work equally well. So that's the kit that you need. And have the next slide, please. Now the method, and I have two approaches, both of which work really well. And the first one is the layering. And the important thing here is, again, like your Battenberg cake, you have to have your layers equal. So about 15 centimeters, which actually is quite a small amount. So in terms of those 5 ingredients I talked about earlier, you'd want to be adding about 15 centimeters of each of those into your compost bin. The second approach, the one I use, which is actually quite a nice thing to do once a week, is to get a large container. It could be a trug, it could be an IKEA bag, and actually then pour or put each of your ingredients into that bag and give them a good mix up and put that into the compost bin. And that actually works really well. Next slide, please. So, yeah, I just wanted to, I'll come back to that. One thing I would say when you're setting up your compost for the first time, or if you're wanting to start again because you're enthused by what you've heard this afternoon, is take it all out and do start again. Put some twigs at the bottom to allow for air at the bottom. The other thing I would say is it's best to have it on the ground so that your workers can get in at the bottom to do their work. And the whole principle of the cooking is the warmer it gets, the faster it works. Grass is most effective at generating heat, but it has to be used in its proportion. So, for example, weeds are killed at 70 degrees when it's got to 70 degrees for 30 minutes. Diseases are killed at over 50 degrees if they've been at that temperature for 72 hours. So it gives you some sort of idea as to how long all this takes. And generally, if you've got a compost bin that's a cool compost bin, which is what most compost bins are, it takes between 6 and 12 months to produce mature compost. So the essence of this is to remember that it needs this combination of moisture and air to thrive and keep it well fed. One thing I just wanted to say about making your mixture is it's best to keep everything at the sort of same size. And I say use your fist as an example. So you don't want to be putting in a whole cabbage. You want to tear things up like the cardboard. I would highly recommend scrunching up your eggshells because they seem to be the thing that just take forever to compost, but they are one of the best things that you can have in your compost. In my experience, I have never ever seen an avocado stone decompose, so I wouldn't bother with them. If you feel happy doing it, using a lawnmower is a great way to shred garden waste, obviously wearing appropriate safety wear, but it's a really easy way to take what you've just pulled out of the garden, break it down, and then have it set aside to add into your compost mix. And next slide. So you've got all this wonderful compost. Well, we know what to do with it, but here's some basic ways to use it. You can use it as a mulch to retain moisture and suppress weeds, you'd want to be doing that by applying it at when the soil is warm and moist, and that would be during late spring. Or conversely, you want it to retain heat and suppress weeds, which you'd be applying at the end of the growing season in late autumn. So, but both ways, it's doing something to help your soil, and of course, it's then helping to improve the whole quality of your soil. You can also use it for a planting medium to mix with soil when you're planting new plants, to use directly in your compost for plants and containers. And you can obviously use it as a soil conditioner to dig into your vegetable plot, or as a lawn dressing. What I've tended to do lately is I actually take it out at the point it looks almost done. I set it aside for a few weeks and then I use it, because it seems that bringing it out into the open for a while just finishes off the whole process. So that's one thing that I found helps even more in terms of making it that wonderful material to use. So that's if you like, great if you've got a garden and you've got the ability to do that. If not, another way of helping is to use food waste apps, and these are two that are available as a different approach to sharing your waste, or sharing your ingredients, I should say. And next slide, please. The other way you can get involved in making great soil is to get involved. In York and around Yorkshire, there are a wide number of community gardens and other gardening activities that you can get involved in. And that get involved, by the way, can be taking your compost to those gardens if they have composting areas, or it can be going to them and actually joining in, getting involved in the actual growing. The next step up from that is having an allotment, and again, plenty of those around. And the other thing I think that's really important is to consider your gardening practices if you have a garden, and consider using dig-free gardening. It's not nearly as back-breaking either. And if you're feeding your soil well, you don't need to break it up, and that means obviously that you're letting the workers do their work. Next slide is the other thing we can do is obviously, just as with Food Circle, it is to find your local farmers market and farm shops. And there are some amazing places around us. Us is York, but in the countryside around, and the farm shops, the quality of the food, by the way, coming into Food Circle is amazing. The vegetables in particular. So find one, try it if you haven't already, and of course there are all the human benefits in terms of you're getting better, you're feeding your body better with the nutrients, less chemicals. It helps you build up your resistance and improve your immune system. Why wouldn't we do it? And so, in summary, I come back to the point I made at the beginning. Based on everything that you've heard here today, it's to sort of put the challenge back to you all to say, again, rather than looking at what the big issue is, what one step change could you make to help actually grow soil, help improve the quality of the soil? And I would say, as part of that, be curious. You've come on to this event today. That's being curious. You go out and see what's out there. Tell people about what they could be doing. Start conversations. All that's about being curious, and bit by bit, we get the message out. And that's so yeah. That's the end of my talk. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Shan. We do have, although it might have been already answered by Ruth, Lucy is wanting to know how to minimise the increase in rodents such as rats and mice when composting.
Well, the rats and rodents normally come because there's some sort of food source. I mean, like waste food as opposed to fruit and vegetables. That's what normally attracts them. So don't put that into your composter. And the other thing you can do, if that's a problem, is rather than putting it on the ground, put it on something solid, which then makes it harder for them to get into. That's the best way to try and avoid them coming into your bin.
Great. I mean, other things as well as, share waste. How much are you actually looking at using that now as well in New York? It's kind of growing a lot more, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's I can see from the comments. I actually volunteer at Greenfields Community Gardens. And there we have, I think, 20 compost bins, which we are desperate to have more kitchen waste for, because of course that's the one thing we don't have. And we've never been able to collect the grass. So we have bins available in those gardens for people to bring in their kitchen waste. And so that's, and I think York is great. There are so many community gardens. I know up on South Bank, that there's a community garden there, right across the road from the Golden Ball. That's where it is, and there are many others like that. So, and I think there's a sort of sense of I'm throwing something away, I'm passing it on, but it's not. This is what we really want in terms of the material to make more soil.
I know at the moment I take my compost bin for a walk. And turn one for a walk every week to the local church for their compost bins, because mine's yes.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So just to end, I thought I'd bring in Harry and Hannah and Adrian as well. And if anyone's got questions for any of us, please feel free to ask away. No, just fascinating scales there across all the way from larger agriculture down to what Joe is doing with Food Circle, and into how can you do things at home. I mean, there is a great deal of things happening in York and Yorkshire, as we know. York, is part of the big push for the circular economy and keeping things going in value as much as possible. And actually food waste is one of the big things that it can be spread into into the land. Ask and Brian are actually doing a project at the moment looking at spreading food waste onto the soil and how much depth. I think they've worked it out, it's about a foot, and you just leave it there to actually then start getting absorbed into the soil. So we do need to start engaging everyone and seeing how we can connect with the growers, to the grain producers, to the people even producing down to the waste. Although it's not waste really, if you look into the natural world, it's a resource, and we need to start treating it as that, so we can keep it flowing and everybody understanding and keeping it out, that idea of just chucking it over the fence like you do with your snails and your neighbours. No comment. So any final words from, let's start off in that way, from Shan?
From me, I would say, in terms of Good Food York, we would actively encourage you to join us if it's your first event with us. sign up to participate, follow us on Facebook, on Twitter. We are looking for volunteers to come and work with us. If you're interested, contact us. We'd love to hear from you. Yeah, let's see what we can do to produce more soil.
Great, and then go down to the bottom to Harry. I know he's not at the bottom of your screens, but he's down there in mine. So.
Just the takeaway for me is pulling carbon from the atmosphere into the soil using nature's technology is the solution to many of our problems. And I just, for me, it was a revelation to find out that the carbon pool, the biggest one is the soil, how little time, effort, money, etc. has been spent on this is actually the way to do it. And hopefully by having discussions like we've had this afternoon, more and more people will start to appreciate that, come on guys, there is a way. We don't need to build some whacking great carbon sucking machine and stick it on top of Ben Nevis and then pump it underneath the North Sea. We can do this in our back gardens. We can do this in our agricultural soils. We can do it in our woods. We can do it everywhere. And it's all sat there. It's there for free. No one's got to buy it. So if we can just get this message around to say, let's just move our center of attention towards the soil and let's preserve it.
Yeah, no, great. And I recommend everyone go on to Project Drawdown to see it's almost 100 solutions now for carbon capture and drawdown into our soils and different things from agriculture into cities, transportation, that as well. Now down to Adrian. Any last thoughts in your discussion? Yeah.
Thanks everybody for all your contributions. There's lots going on. What I'm interested in is trying to find ways of joining the dots, trying to pull it all together. So I'd really hope that as we develop, Good Food York could become an alliance of all of these different things, the really good things that are going on. And I'd reiterate, do go and look at Food Circle, because that's a great way of finding out all the regenerative agriculture and bread and grain orchards, all these different producers right here on our doorstep, talking to other customers, talking to all the producers, buying the food, tasting it. So I'm reiterating that again, let's find a way of linking the growers to us consumers in York.
That's great, thank you. And final words over to Hannah, actually.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to echo everything that's been said already. It's such an exciting time. I think it's a really inspirational place to be at the moment in Yorkshire and across England as well. There's so much potential. And yeah, thank you so much for all the contributions. It's been really interesting, and hopefully this is just the start.
Perfect, thank you very much. Now, I'd like to do something a little bit silly, what we tend to do. So is everybody could turn on their cameras, and we're just going to do a wave bye-bye, and we're going to capture it as a screen share. So everybody turn it on, that's it. If you can, don't worry if you can't, or if it's too late or too early, or you're in your pajamas. I mean, one thing that I've noticed during lockdown is we are saving the planet through lack of using water because we're not washing as much. Or is that only me?
I think that's just you, Rich.
Yeah, I washed today just for this. Yeah, thank you.
It's a noble effort, though.
Thank you very much, Harry. I don't know if that was a compliment or an insult.
Oh, no, a compliment, of course.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. Now, just finally, I'll just share the last couple of slides with some details of how you can get in contact with us again. And there's our details. You can email us at info@goodfoodyork.org or find us on Twitter, on Facebook. And the key thing here is really takeaway is about being curious and where your food's coming from, how things we can change, and all the way down to our soil. And yeah, thank you very much to the hosts of York Environment Week and Circular Yorkshire, led by the North Yorkshire Let. And thank you everyone for coming. Some people from near, some people from very, very far. It's great to have somebody there from Inverary in Ontario, Canada. I recommend, Douglas, you should actually attend a conference next week on urban agriculture hosted in Guelph virtually. And University of Guelph are doing a lot of stuff actually on agriculture in general. So if anyone wants to hang around, have a chat, feel free to. Unless, I don't know if anyone's got anywhere else to go. You know, it's not really the most pleasant weather in New York today, is it? It's kind of 50 shades of grey outside. More so if you've travelled up to Aberdeen. But anyway, yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.